Solve a generative study. In this video, we'll use a previewer and we'll solve a generative design study. In Fusion 360, we want to get started with the supplied dataset Generative Design Geometry Setup version 11. This version is very similar to the one that we've been working on, however, there are some changes. If we take a look at the front of the steering stem, we now have some additional obstacles, as well as a tube that runs through the center of it to make sure that we don't have any build in that area. We also have a slight change to the front of the engine geometry. What we see here instead of a large fillet is we have more of a chamfer with filleted front and side edges. The reason for this is because we really need to have a line of sight between our preserved geometries. This means that in order to get a build region or to get started on the generative solve, we want to make sure that the preserve at the front of the bike can see the engine mounts here and that the engine mounts can see the next one and so on. There is still a problem in this area with the shock because we do have such a large region that is obscuring the line of sight here. So this area is likely going to be problematic, but a good way for us to check and tell is to use what's called the previewer. And once you launch the previewer, there's a small gear icon for settings, and generally I like to go to the high level of detail. This will increase the mesh resolution and give us a better chance of seeing whether or not we're getting a region that's being built. Now, oftentimes what'll happen if we don't have line of sight or if we just barely are outside of that line of sight, then it'll take a lot longer to get the first iterations of the solve going. And then we'll have problems downstream, just simply not getting enough iterations to get an adequate result. What we can see here is that the build region is starting, but it is going through some of our obstacles. And likely over time, we would get a better result, but it's going to cause a lot of computation to happen, and ultimately it's going to affect the downstream results. Because of this, I'm going to go to my unassigned geometry and show it. And there is also a piece of geometry in here that is a starting shape for us. So inside of here, we're going to go to our design space dropdown and select starting shape. Then we want to select this rough frame outline and we'll select OK. This is going to give this generative solve a little bit better idea of where we want it to build. If we hide the obstacle geometry and we just take a look at this, it now knows exactly where it needs to start and where it needs to build to, and this will give it a better starting point and ultimately give us a better result. While the starting shape is not required for all generative solves, if you have complex geometry like this, and we have a lot of obstacles that we need to make sure that we avoid, it's a good idea for us to use that starting shape to better drive the starting point of our design. Even though we're letting the computer decide, oftentimes we know about what we want it to look like just simply based on our own experience. So from here, we can select Generate. It's important to note that we still do have a warning, and the warning is telling us that we have an issue with the size of our part and that costing is going to be a problem and that the additive manufacturing or 3D printing is going to be a problem because the part is just too large. Since we're not using that manufacturing method, that's okay. But it's always a good idea to double check. You can select Repair from here, or you can go back to the pre-check and take a look at what it's telling us. So the studied geometry, too large for 3D print, that's perfectly fine again because we're not using that manufacturing method. The last step in the process before I go ahead and generate this is I want to go back to my study settings, make sure that my mesh resolution is okay. And in this case, I'm actually going to use the alternative outcomes. Because we want to explore as many possibilities, we want to use that alternative outcomes, which again is a preview functionality. So you will need to go into your user preferences, make sure that you do go to preview features, select generative design, and make sure that you turn on the experimental generative solvers and features. Once that's turned on, I'll go back to generate now that I'm happy with all the settings, and note that I am going to have to use 33 cloud credits. In order for you to follow along with the course, you will need to solve the generative study, which will be that 33 cloud credits. If you don't solve the generative study, we will still provide the results so you can follow along with the rest of the course, creating simulations and following along with the downstream manipulations. But in order to go through the Explore interface, you will need to solve your own study. It's not an option to have a file that contains those generative solves because all that data is stored on the cloud and it is linked to the original design. A copy of the design or a download link simply won't contain that data. When solutions are being generated, Fusion 360 will automatically bring you into the Explore interface. You can see the iterations being created live, and this process tends to take a little bit of time. Depending on the amount of materials and manufacturing methods, the study settings, and your objectives, and whether or not you're using these additional solves and features, this process could take as little as under an hour, or it could take several hours to start to see converged or completed results. For this process, I fully expect this to take at least an hour to have converged results on at least a few of the iterations. So you can feel free to watch and explore these as they're being generated. But for the course, we're going to check back in once everything is converged and solved, and then we can explore the results together.